Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Winter Wonderland photography. I'm really excited about this webinar. It's one of my favorite things to take pictures of, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So the first thing that I want to go over is going to be about what to do when your cameras are in snow. If you've ever lived somewhere where there's snow, again, I know a lot of you guys probably live somewhere that's a lot warmer than it is here or in other places in the US, but just in case you live somewhere with snow, Canon and Nikon guarantee that your equipment actually works all the way down to freezing, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. Now, for the most part, photographers have been taking their cameras out into places that are much colder than that. So we're talking -30, -40. Photographers have been taking modern digital cameras to places like Iceland, the Arctic Circle, Antarctica, and about 80% of the time, the cameras continue to work. But you do run into issues when you start to get extremely cold. Now, this only covers modern digital cameras, ones that have been made in the last 5 to 10 years, because they have a whole bunch of specialty mechanisms in them in the actual way that the shutter snaps down and creates your image that doesn't require you to have to do a lot of work to make it actually run. If it gets so cold, sometimes you run into issues with it not actually being able to shut down. And sometimes the technology that's in your camera can actually halt if it gets too cold. But for the most part, people are living in places that aren't, hopefully, aren't that much lower than -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and so their cameras are going to keep on working. Now, you can see right down at the bottom, there's an operating environment screenshot that I took for you guys, and this is what's on Canon's website and Nikon's. This I shot on Canon's, but the Nikon one is exactly the same, I promise. And this is their operating environment that they suggest for the Canon 5D Mark II and Mark III, and most of their other digital SLR cameras. The working temperature range is 32 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And just in case you wanted to know, the working humidity range is 85% or less. When you get up to really high humidity, sometimes you get a lot of condensation and it can screw up your camera. But that's what it says on their website. Now, just in case you're out there and you're using really old film cameras, there's a completely different shutter mechanism that used to be used for a lot of old film cameras and even some of the original digital cameras. Now, the difference is you actually have to lubricate the shutter mechanism to make it work in freezing temperatures. Most of the time, they actually start to shut down after about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I have a lot of film cameras, and I have to bring oil with me to make sure that the shutters continue to shoot if I'm taking pictures in very cold environments. So just in case you're out there still shooting with snow images and you're out in the world and you're using those film cameras, you may actually have to bring some sort of oil-based lubrication. And that can help that shutter mechanism go. But for the most part, you guys won't have to worry unless you're getting down below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, along with your cameras are going to be your lenses. And lenses are actually one of the biggest problems that I've found when shooting in snow. And one of the reasons why is something called condensation. Condensation is what happens when you take an object. We're going to talk about lenses. So you take a lens, you take it from a warm environment to a cold environment, back to a warm environment, back and forth, back and forth. You'll see this a lot when you're out in the cold. Let's say you're walking around and you're going from a warm environment, your home, you're going outside, let's say to walk a couple blocks to the store, and it's freezing outside, there's snow. You get really cold, and then you walk back into a warm environment, and all of the little snowflakes maybe that were on your face, all of the snow that maybe landed on your coat and your jacket or your hat will start to melt away. That's what condensation is, and that's what happens. So one of the things that I think a lot of people don't necessarily remember to pay attention to is the fact that condensation can actually happen on your cameras and on your equipment. And this is one of the biggest problems that lenses are going to run into when you're taking pictures in the snow. Now, if your temperatures are extremely low, what happens is if you have any condensation on your lens whatsoever by taking it in and out of the cold repeatedly, the water that gets on your lens can actually freeze if you don't clean off the condensation quickly. If you try and wipe away a lot of those frozen water droplets, you can actually scratch your lens. Now, this is extreme, and this is what happens, again, when you're shooting somewhere that's really cold. I had a friend who actually went down to Antarctica on a work trip, and she was taking pictures and she accidentally scratched her lens with a little bit of ice. And this is not very typical when it does happen, but just in case, you want to make sure that you wipe the condensation on your lenses away. So carry a lens cloth, most people have them, and you can wipe away whatever water is excess on the lens, which is pretty much all water on your lens is going to be excess, and it helps cut down on the moisture. Now, the other thing to help remove condensation altogether is actually to keep your cameras and lenses in plastic bags. This is a little insider tip that I learned from one of my old photo teachers back a long time ago, and we used to do this with our film cameras. I lived in Boston for a long time, and it gets very, very cold there. Frozen pipes, lots of snow. And I spent a lot of time in Vermont as well, and it's the same deal. Very cold, lots of snow. If you put your camera and your lenses in plastic bags, and let's say you're going from a warm environment, and then you go outside, and then you go back into your car, and then you go back outside to take more pictures, which is most of the time what's happening. You're going in and out of your car and other warm environments before you take your images. Keeping your cameras in plastic bags all the time helps cut down on all of that excess condensation. Only take your cameras and your lenses out when you're ready to shoot, and then drop them back in those plastic bags immediately. The less time they spend out in the cold, the better. Now, cameras and lenses in the rain are a slightly different thing. Most of the time when it's raining, it's obviously not quite as cold, but again, just in case you live somewhere like Portland, you're going to run into a lot of rain during the winter time. Waterproofing your cameras, there are lots of different options out there, which is fantastic. If you're willing to spend the money, which some people are and some people want them, you can actually buy very expensive hard waterproof cases, which means they're hard plastic, and they can range all the way up to $1,000. What's great is they're actually specific to the models of cameras that you may have. So if you go onto Canon's website, they have an entire section all about waterproof or underwater or water-based photography, and they have a list of all of the different hard cases that you can buy through them. Again, most of the time they're very expensive, but they're specific to the cameras, and they can also mean that you can take your cameras into places like underwater scenes. So if you're going to be doing things like going scuba diving, if you're going to be going and taking pictures in a pool, if you want to take images of surfers or anything like that, having something that is an expensive hard case can be great. If you don't want to spend quite as much money, you can also get soft cases, and these are waterproof, soft, squishy cases that you can put around your lenses, your cameras, your tripods. They even have waterproof cases for smaller things like memory cards and batteries and so on. Two of the best companies to buy those from, and the one that I have is by something called Vortex Media, and then there's also something called Aquatech. They both have absolutely fantastic waterproof soft cases for your images. Vortex Media is actually one that I believe it still is, most National Geographic photographers use Vortex Media. They have some of the best waterproof cases out there. And it doesn't matter whether you're a professional photographer like one of them or whether you're just a hobbyist, they're a lot cheaper. They only range from about $100 to $300. And again, they can be made specifically to smaller or larger cameras, and they make them for other accessories like lenses and tripods if you don't want to get any of those things wet. So both of those companies are really, really great, and they have wonderful cases. Now, just in case you want a third option, a very cheap way to make a waterproof case is to just take a very large plastic bag and attach it to a lens hood with some gaffer's tape. And I used to do this a long time ago in college before I got a nice waterproof case that I have now. And all you do is take the opening of the plastic bag, you put it with your lens hood and you tape it on, and then you stick your lens hood, put your camera in the bag, and then you screw on your lens hood to your lens. And all of a sudden you have a very cheap but very awesome waterproof case. All of the buttons are going to work through all of these different bags or all of these different cases, so you don't have to worry about not being able to press things like your shutter or check photos on the back camera or anything like that. So these are all very good options. One of the things that I do recommend is that you invest in some bar towels so that you can wipe things off very quickly and easily. You wouldn't wipe off any of the glass on your lens, but everything else can be soaked up with bar towels. And they're the most, at least what I've noticed anyways, they're the ones that suck up the most moisture because they're used in bars, and bartenders are, wiping up spilled drinks, water, ice, all that kind of stuff. And so they're really, really absorbent. Another little tip is, if you ever get some sort of packaging box and you get a small packet of something called silica, which I think everybody's seen. You get it in toys and video game systems and shoes and pretty much anything you're going to buy on the internet that's a larger package that may cause some sort of water condensation. They put silica packets in. Throw them into your camera bag and it helps keep it completely dry. All that silica's job is when they put it into this package, or its main job is to cut down on all of that excess moisture. It captures a lot of the moisture and keeps it inside. So throw a couple of those packets in the different pockets inside your camera bag and it cuts down on all of that excess water. Now, the last two things that I think a lot of people forget about are your batteries and your memory cards. Now, most people out there use something called a new lithium-ion battery. That's what 98% of digital cameras are using nowadays, are lithium-ion batteries, and they can survive up to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and have actually had success even lower. A lot of times, your batteries can survive longer than your cameras and your lenses can, as well as your memory cards. They're pretty amazing. Even though they work in extremely cold temperatures, you do want to keep them in a warm place. I suggest keeping batteries in your pockets or keeping them so that they're close to your body or keeping them in bags away from the cold. Now, if you have an older camera, film camera, they use something called nickel metal hydride batteries, which I spelled wrong. Nickel metal hydride batteries, and they actually can fail after 0 degrees Fahrenheit. They're not as sturdy as lithium-ion batteries, and they're usually only found in those old film cameras. Most people don't have to worry about those. Now, memory cards usually work to about -20 degrees Fahrenheit, but they can actually be stored all the way down to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. To use them and actually access them, they'll need to be warmer, but to store them, you can get them very cold. Now, what's suggested is just like with the batteries, despite the fact that they can fail in extremely low temperatures, you want to keep them in a warm place. So I usually keep my batteries and my memory cards close to my body. I keep them in pockets on my pants, or I keep them in my pockets on my shirt so that I know that they're closer to my body temperature and they're staying warm. And then I don't have to worry about them getting too cold. I pull them out when I need them and I put them away when I'm done. So there's a lot of tech-based stuff that actually goes along with taking these winter wonderland photos. And a lot of people don't know that parts of your camera can actually fail in these colder environments, which I think is very fascinating. Now, really quickly, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the other things that go along with snow photography and rain photography. Now, exposure compensation is one of the things that a lot of people forget about. When you're taking pictures of an entirely white backdrop, you're going to run into some exposure issues. If you're using all automatic focus, exposure, and white balance tools, these are going to apply a little bit more towards you. If you like to do everything manually, you can manually adjust things, and you'll have a little bit less of an issue here. When you focus on an image and when you focus on a photo almost entirely of snow, and you're actually trying to get the plane of focus on the physical snow, which is the image on the left, what happens is it creates more of a grayish tone instead of making it bright white. That photo on the left with the little footprints that are coming down in the snow, I focused on the actual physical snowflakes. And what happened is my camera tried to compensate automatically, and it creates more of a grayish sheet on the snow instead of creating something that's bright white. And this is pretty typical. A way to counteract that is just by manually compensating by adjusting your exposure to +1 so that it overexposes just a tad. It seems a little bit counterintuitive, and I know that, at least for me anyway, sometimes my brain has a hard time comprehending that. One of the great ways to counteract that issue is just by upping your exposure a little bit. Now, the image on the right, I focused on those darker trees that were in the background, and you'll see that the photo looks a lot more overexposed, and it causes the snow and the sky, it was a sunny day, it causes the snow and the sunny sky to be overexposed and kind of blown out. So you can manually compensate by adjusting your exposure to -1 and toning down your exposure. Now, what I typically do, and what I think a lot of photographers would suggest, is something called bracketing. You take a photo that is overexposed, a photo that's underexposed, and a photo that is straight smack dab in the middle, and you can go through and you can either combine them all together or you can use the one that works the best. Instead of having to go through and manually adjust every single photo, you can bracket and get one under, one over, and one in the middle. That tends to save a little bit of time while you're out shooting, and as long as you're using large memory cards, it doesn't take up an excess amount of space, and you can turn it off very, very, very quickly. Some snow photography tips for you guys, and these are ones that I love and I use all the time. Try focusing on some smaller elements. You have beautiful, big, sweeping landscapes. They're absolutely amazing, but there are also a lot of very intimate details when it comes to snow. You get things like frost. You can see on the right-hand side, this image is very frosty, very cold, and it kind of captures that chill that you get when you walk outside. You can also take pictures. You get these, again, beautiful sweeping landscapes. They can be very beautiful, but also it's very nice to capture a more serene, I guess almost silent image. The photo that you'll see on the left-hand side had an Orton effect glow applied to it, so it's kind of more of a high contrast. It's very dark, kind of moody, but it's also very, very simple. And that can be a really nice way to capture that feeling of winter. Portraits are also wonderful when it comes to taking images. Because you have a white backdrop of snow already, it's basically like shooting in a fake studio. If it's slightly sunny outside, which can sometimes cause problems when you're taking pictures out in the cold, you still have a nice sun glow that can happen on a portrait. You've basically got this kind of fake studio lighting going on, but you also have a white backdrop. If you're taking pictures in other locations too, you have a whole bunch of other white-based backdrops. A lot of people, when they live in snowy environments, you're going to run into a lot of nice trees with big, green, lush. We live in Oregon, so everything is green and lush all the time. But you'll either run into soft browns or you're going to run into soft greens, and those both make really, really good backdrops. And just in case you don't actually want to go outside, winter is a wonderful time to take your portraits inside, and you can actually create kind of more of a winter-style portrait effect. If people don't want to go outside and stand in freezing temperatures, just pull them inside instead and put them in their hats and their scarves, put them in their mittens, and take photos of them in the studio. You can adjust things. If you're working with models, you can adjust things like clothing and makeup to make it appear as though they're outside, and you can place them in winter scenes. So just in case you don't want to go outside, use the studio because this is a wonderful time to do so. And I had 2 other images here. All of these have been edited with the suite, by the way. On the left is a portrait with that kind of white evergreen style backdrop. And again, this can be a great time to take portraits and give it that soft bluish greenish glow. So it really kind of gives off the feel of winter. And on the right-hand side, you can actually apply a warmer tone to the backdrop. So for this image, it was a sky. If you apply that warmer tone to the backdrop, it counteracts some of that colder feeling that you get during the winter time. A lot of people have these images that are very cool. And so by making the sky a little bit warmer, you've got a slightly different balance in the foreground and the background. Now, if you're taking pictures in the rain, there are lots of different ways to kind of pump up your images a little bit. Don't be afraid of the rain. It is a wonderful, wonderful, stunning backdrop for your images. And one of the reasons why is because it creates slick surfaces. And these surfaces can be used to create reflections, which are wonderful, or they're great for soft focus opportunities. If you have images where you want to create something that's a little bit hazier, a little bit glowier, a little bit softer, that soft focus that happens when the rain slides down a glass window is fantastic. Your rain gear make wonderful props. You'll see in this image here, the umbrella, that bright magenta umbrella, is a beautiful pop right in the middle of this image, and it can really make an urban landscape that would be a little bit dull pop out. People also are carrying around colorful rain boots, as well as really, really slick jackets that are bright colors. So use the props if you don't necessarily want to have something that's a little bit duller, a little bit colder, a little bit less vibrant. And that is something that's pretty typical, especially, again, when you live somewhere where it rains all the time, it can be very, very drab. Also, you have the action of the water actually falling in front of you. So you can either stop it and use a flash to really make the droplets pop out a little bit, use a fast shutter speed, or you can actually use it to create a blurrier background, have a lot of rain set up in the background so that it's falling. Put your camera on a tripod and use a slow shutter speed and get a really interesting effect. You don't have to let it stop you from taking pictures of landscapes. On the left-hand side is a beautiful landscape that was taken while it was raining. The Columbia River down in the back has this nice soft glow to it so that it looks very serene. The clouds create a moodier style to the image. It's a lot more intense than I think people assume that it could be. So don't ever be afraid of not being able to take pictures in the rain. Those slick streets and wet landscapes are great because they can create these really nice pops of color, can create beautiful reflections, and can create really, really bright spots in your images. And then down on the bottom right, you've got a nice soft focus image of slippery glass. And these can be used not only as photos on their own, but they're also really great as textures too. So you have lots of different ways for using all of these different images. Now, I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk you guys through some of the editing techniques. Obviously, this is a lot of information and a lot of it is about gear, but I know that you guys want to see how some of this is actually achieved. One of the biggest problems that you're going to run into when you're taking pictures of snow is actually going to be white balance. Back in the days of film, you used to actually be able to use, there's something called white balance cards, and they pop up all the time. A lot of people don't use them nowadays, but it was a way for you to white balance your images a little bit more successfully by holding up a small card that was either gray or white. And again, nowadays people don't typically use that very often, but you still can. A lot of cameras do this automatically for you. But I want to show you some of the issues that you're going to run into with exposure and with white balance when you're editing your photos. And then I'm also going to take this portrait on the left-hand side and a similar landscape on the right-hand side to this photo. And I want to show you how to edit them really quickly and achieve more of that winter stylization. Okay, let's jump into Lightroom here. I've got a whole bunch of photos that I want to talk you guys through. There are a couple that I just want to show you very quickly so that you can see them. Umbrellas make a wonderful backdrop in rain images. Even if it's not necessarily raining that hard, I was over at this place called Multnomah Falls when I took this image, and it wasn't actually pouring for this photo. My friend needed a picture for her portfolio, and I needed to get a photo, and she wanted it to have that kind of Oregon style feel to it. So we just popped open the umbrella. It had a beautiful blue hue to it, and this can be used as a great way of making it look, even if it wasn't raining, making it look like it has that kind of rainy, wintry Pacific Northwest feel to it. So don't ever be afraid of using umbrellas as backdrops. Another great thing about snow, again, is the fact that you have that very soft, very simple look of white. Taking pictures of things like footsteps, whether it be your own, a friend's, or even an animal's, is a great way to kind of show the idea of snow and the fact that our people are actually stepping in it. This is one of my favorite ways of capturing the snow. And this is also a great photo to show you a little bit more about underexposed images and white balance. So I'm going to take this over into the photo suite. Now, because I'm going through Lightroom, really quickly, there are two different ways that I can get into the suite. I can either right-click my image really quickly and go down to Edit In, or I can go up to the File menu and go down to Plugin Extras. And I'm going to go through Plugin Extras because it gives me access to using the photo suite as pretty much a whole program, a whole application. Everything that we're going to do in the suite today, you can do through any of the other programs that you may use, or you can use the photo suite as just a plain standalone. And that's usually how I like to work. But again, because I was in Lightroom, I'm going to go through this Plugin Extras menu and I'm going to go down and choose Perfect Photo Suite 8. Now, when we take this image, it's going to copy it over, and take this image into the suite. The first thing that I recommend before doing anything is cropping or straightening your image. I already did that for this photo, which is why I brought it in here. Now I want to make some quick, again, basic adjustments to this image. So I'm going to start out in one of our new programs called Enhance. I'll click on Enhance, it'll transfer me over there. Now, one of the reasons why I went here, started me out in perfect layers, and then I went into Enhance is because before I save this image, I'll be able to have access to my entire layered based workflow, and that's really helpful to me. Now, on the right-hand side in Enhance, right up at the top is the Quick Fixes pane, and this is where you're going to typically start out with your photo. You've got two buttons at the top, Auto Levels and Auto Color. Now, Auto Levels is going to go through and adjust the whites and your blacks of your image. So this is our original photo. I focused down on this little footstep on the bottom of my image here. I'm kind of circling it so that you can see it there. When I turn the Auto Levels button on, it brightens up the whites in the image and intensifies the blacks in the background just enough that it has that nice high contrast look. Now, when I click Auto Color, it's actually going to cool the image down a little bit. The Auto Color button works great on this photo. What I want to show you is what happens when you use a white balance tool. A lot of programs, whether it be the photo suite, whether you're going to use Perfect Enhance or Perfect Effects to do this, or if you're using other programs like Lightroom, Aperture, Photoshop, and so on, most of them have an eyedropper tool so that you can access a gray point. And this will work very similarly to the Auto Color button, except you have more control over what you want to be a neutral in your image. Now, when I select this tool and we click on somewhere in our snow, watch what happens to the image. Let me undo that really quick and we can do it again. This is our photo. This is what we're looking at before we use that gray balance tool. When I click on the snow in my image, it automatically creates this warmer tone to the photo. You're going to run into this a very large portion of the time when you use white balance tools, and it doesn't matter what program. I've done this in Lightroom, Aperture, Photoshop. I've done this in Elements. I've done this here. It always seems to make my image warmer. A lot of times, most of these programs have a really hard time using snow as the actual neutral point to balance your image. And that's one of the reasons why being able to adjust the color, you'll see a lot of snow images, snow landscapes that have a tint to them. And a lot of people say they do it on purpose. And that is very true. A lot of people do it on purpose. But it is very hard to white balance snow. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually kind of difficult. Now, what's great about this is a lot of snow images are highly stylized, and I tend to like my snow photos highly stylized. So I'm okay hand adjusting this. But be careful with those white balance tools like this eyedropper here because it can create kind of funky color tones on your image. I'm going to go back and click on auto. I want that cooler look to my image. Now for this photo, one of the things that I want to do is pull out the shadow information. This image is still a little too dark to me. In my color and tone adjustments pane, I have my basics. I've got brightness and contrast here. I'm going to brighten up the image a little bit. I want to be careful how much I brighten it up because you'll see if I go too far, I'm going to really blow out a lot of the snow and the sky behind it. So I'm not going to go overboard with brightness, just enough to make those whites pop out a bit more. I also am going to take my shadow slider and move that over to the right. Not a ton, just a little bit, so that I can bring a bit more information into the trees in the back. The last thing that I want to do here is add just a tiny amount of detail. Not a lot, just a little bit. Move that over to the right so it'll crisp up some of the little flakes and spots in the snow down on the bottom of my image here. Now, before we leave Perfect Enhance, one of the other reasons why I like going in here and doing all of these basic adjustments, I could technically do them in Lightroom if I wanted to, but I like bringing it in here because I have access to the Perfect Eraser, and that's our content-aware fill tool. And when you're creating a slightly more serene landscape, one of the biggest problems that you're going to run into are a lot of those excess little elements in there that are distracting. I want to be able to look at this photo and just see those footsteps. It took me a minute to remember what they were called. I want to be able to just see that line of footsteps headed toward the camera. And there are all of these little bumps that are in the way. Now, one of the biggest problems in this is the fact that we here in Oregon don't get a ton of snow, so it wasn't a very heavy snowfall for this image, and that's part of the reason why there's a lot of dirt and rocks that are showing through. And I want to be able to get rid of them, and that's when the Perfect Eraser is going to come in handy. It helps me simplify my landscape a bit more. If you have an image like this one that has a little bit more snow, I almost guarantee there are going to be a few small spots, maybe where there's a piece of grass coming through the snow you don't want there, if there's a footstep you don't actually want there, all different types of distractions that can pull away from the feel of the image. So I'm just going to take this perfect eraser and I'm going to go through and I'm going to click over the areas that I want to remove. And because it's a nice, simple backdrop, it does a great job of removing all of these little elements for me pretty quickly. And I can use this anywhere in the image, but I'm just going to go through and do a very quick overview of a lot of these smaller little spots in the foreground here. But this is a good place to start, and it's one of the reasons why I like to use Enhance, because I can use all of these different tools together in one fell swoop instead of having to go into multiple different programs here. All right. Now, if I was going through and I was spending a large amount of time, I would probably go and remove all of these different little spots, but because there are so many in here, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that so that I can move on to the next enhancement I want to show you guys. So we got rid of most of those little extra bits and spots. Those are going to drive me crazy if I don't remove them. I want to now take this into Perfect Effects. I'll go up to the top right-hand corner. This is our module selector here, and I'll just click on Effects and it'll transfer me over there. All of those enhancements that I made in Perfect Enhance are going to stay the same. They're going to be on a separate layer than all of the changes that I make in Effects too, which is great. So if I make an image in Effects that I don't really like, I can always go back to the retouched image that I started with here, which is great. Now, one of the things that I recommend on the left-hand side of the image, there's going to be the filters library. These are all the different beast filters you can apply to your images, and there are quite a few here that you can add. One of the ones that's very popular, especially again with these kind of white snow style images, is under the glow category. Adding a very soft, subtle glow is a great way to create a very simple, serene image. I mentioned earlier something called the Orton effect, and it was named after a photographer, and he created this very interesting technique in the darkroom to create a soft, hazy glow to images. They were high contrast, but they also had a nice vibrancy to them. It was very impressive. He was an amazing photographer and an amazing editor. And we recreated a very similar style here underneath the glow category, and this can be a very good option for these winter landscape images. Now, one of my favorites is called Charge More Strong. It's high contrast. We'll go ahead and click to add it here so you can see it. I like the high contrast. I think it's a really nice look. You can lose a little bit of detail, so I would suggest painting some back in the areas that you may want them to, but this can be a good look if this is exactly what you're going for. There are lots of other glows that you can access. That's one of my favorites, the Charge More series. There are lots of different options too. There's Charge More Normal, which I'll click on to apply. It's a little bit more subtle. If you don't want that high contrast Orton style effect to it, you don't have to worry about it. They've got a couple different looks in here. And there are tons of other glows that you can add. Some that are specific to certain colors to make them a little bit more vibrant, some that are going to be a little bit lighter, and some that'll be a little bit darker. One of my favorites is called Orton Clean right here, and again, it's high contrast, soft glow. Now, if you're not necessarily going for a glow look, it's totally fine. If you want something that's a little bit more intense, higher contrast, but still highly detailed, that's when you're going to jump up to our dynamic contrast filter. And it's great. They're right next to each other, so you don't have to go jumping around to find them. This is a good way to bring out a lot of the grit that you're going to find in, say, you're out taking pictures of a forest and you get all those little tiny tree branches with snow all over them and so on. This will bring out all of the intensity, all of that detail in the snowy landscape. So if that's going to be the way that you go, you'll want to try out the dynamic contrast look. I'm going to go and choose this soft preset here, and you'll see a big difference in our image. Now, dynamic contrast is very easy to use. Down at the bottom, you have highlight and shadow recovery sliders, as well as white and black sliders. I suggest playing around with these a bit or clicking the auto button so that you can set your whites and your blacks. When you're adding dynamic contrast, especially to images with a white backdrop, sometimes it's nice to pump up, ooh, not that much, pump up the whites a little bit so that they still maintain a little bit of vibrancy and brightness, because they can get a little bit of dark when you add the dynamic contrast there. Don't go overboard like I just did too, because sometimes you end up with an overblown image. So I keep it down between like 10 and 20. Now the detail sliders are going to be the ones that are the most important. These give you the ability to add contrast to selective areas in your image. So if we start everything at 0, it's separated our photo down into large elements, small, tiny details, and then kind of a mid-range section of medium-sized elements. And you can use each one of these sliders selectively. If I use this small slider here and I move that over to the right, it's not going to add a lot of change to this image because there aren't a lot of very fine details in the photo. So I'm going to drop that down back towards 0. The large slider is going to affect these very large areas of contrast. You're going to see changes in the tire tracks here, a lot of the trees in the background, as well as these footsteps down the middle of the image. When I push this over to the right, it's going to add a very subtle amount of contrast to all of those spots, and it kind of intensifies the photo. It's going to be the same with the medium contrast. It's going to hit some of these smaller little grit and detail areas in the foreground. Now, the last thing that I would suggest doing when you're working on photos like this one is adjusting the color. And this image is still, at least for me anyways, way too warm. It doesn't really give off that feel of winter. In the filter stack, I'm going to click the plus button right here. It'll give me an empty layer. And down in the filter options pane, I'll open up this drop-down menu. And right up towards the top is something called the color enhancer. This is a great way to adjust color in your image, whether it be subtle or whether it be very strong. Now, it's going to go through and apply an auto adjustment to your image, but you can turn that off just by clicking the auto button. I'll turn that off for me. And I can manually go through here and adjust the temperature and the tint. So if I want to cool the image down even more, so it has that really chilly, frosty look, it's a little bit more stylized. A good thing to do is also add a tiny bit of magenta because it adds more of a purple blue to the image instead of just a straight kind of cyan-based blue. So if you want that more violet look to your blue that you're adding to your image, that can be a good way to do it. If you want something that's a little bit more cyan, a little bit more teal, something that's got more green, you can go the opposite direction. It's totally up to you, but you can play around with what color you want your image to be. And I suggest when you're working on photos like this, add that kind of stylized color effect to it. I think it's very popular nowadays to add that high vibrancy look. And we can take our vibrant slider and move that over to the right to really pump it up a bit more. Now, what's great about this is you also have access to your color range drop-down slider here. When I open this up, it's separated your photo down into color channels and you can edit them separately. If you have a section of your image, and let's say I want most of this photo to be pretty blue or green, there's this strip right in the middle here of, I guess, orangey yellow. And this is the dirt that hadn't really been touched by the snow. Again, not a lot of snow here in Oregon, so there's still a little bit of leftover dirt in the background. I can go to my color range drop-down menu here and select either the oranges or the yellows. And I can actually desaturate some of those colors to create a little bit more of a unified color effect. And you'll see, here's our before. You can see that dirt right in the middle is still pretty bright. And dropping the saturation down, I'm just pulling that color away a bit more so that I'm not focusing on that strange strip of warmth in the middle of my image. And I would go through and I would access both the yellow and the orange sliders to pull both of those down a bit more. And then I have a much less bright, intense look on that little center strip. And I like this because I can affect all of those colors in my image. I find that very useful. Some people want to keep everything at kind of more of a high vibrant, high saturation look, and that's totally fine. I like to kind of detract from a lot of those warmer colors so I can create a more unified bluish style to my image. There are lots of other effects that you can add to images like this, but I want to quickly transfer over to a portrait look and show you a couple of other options that you might have. I'm going to very quickly apply this effect here. It's going to take just a second, and then it's actually going to transfer me back over to perfect layers. I want to save this image so I can put it back into Lightroom and have access to it. So let's go ahead and we're going to click Save down on the bottom right-hand corner. It's going to go through and save our image here. And we'll close out of it and jump back to Lightroom. Now this is our original photo here. And let me turn my filters off so we can actually see the photo. Now, when you're working on an image and you're taking a look at a photo that's been altered inside the suite, you can take an image and you can take a look. My after photo has disappeared because I put it in a different folder. But you can see your before and after image, and you can see that our original photo here is pretty flat. There isn't a lot of information in there. There isn't a lot of stuff in there. It's really boring, which sounds mean, but it's unfortunately true. It's just a very boring image. This is our after photo. It's a lot brighter. It has a little bit more of a winter style feel. I've desaturated a lot of those warmer tones, and I've really brought out a lot of that cooler bluish look. So I've completely stylized the image so that we've pulled away from this kind of distracting tone and accessed a very different one. Now, this isn't necessarily the kind of shot that I bet a lot of you guys have in colder environments. But again, when you're somewhere where it doesn't snow a ton, this is probably the most access I get to snow year round. So it's very exciting. And I had to drive an hour to get to snow. So it doesn't really do that here in Portland, unfortunately. Now, the other image that I wanted to show you really quickly was this photo here. And it's a picture that I took of a friend of mine, and I used the snow and the green of the trees as a really good backdrop. This is our original photo, and this is straight out of the camera. There's absolutely nothing done to this image. Every change that I made to this photo happened inside Perfect Effects. So I want to really quickly show you some of the filters that I used to bring out these different colors. So this time I'm just going to right-click on my photo. Right-click, go to Edit In, and choose Perfect Effects 8. I'm going to edit a copy of my image with Lightroom adjustments here. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. Wanted to make sure it was opening up the photo suite there. Now, the first thing that we want to do to this image, and I'm not going to do it to this photo because it'll take a little bit of time, is if you're editing portraits, you want to make sure you do all of your retouching before you go in and add other types of adjustments to your image. I would put this photo through the portrait enhancer very quickly. He doesn't have very blotchy or very unblemished skin. It's actually very nice, so I don't need to worry about doing that. If you want slightly softer skin, I would suggest either taking this into Perfect Portrait or using that portrait enhancer filter here in Effects so that I have a better base for my images before I go through and add other effects. Now, back in older versions of the suite, I added multiple different filters to create the same look, but here inside Perfect Effects 8, there's actually a filter that does almost everything I need for me, which is awesome. It's called the Sunshine filter. Now, what you're probably thinking is the fact that the sunshine filter creates sunshine, which it does. And a lot of people assume that sunshine means warmth. What's awesome about the sunshine filter is it doesn't have to. And I think that that is the most amazing thing. So I'm just going to start up here and select this natural preset just so I have a good base. On the right-hand side in the filter options pane, I have a whole bunch of different options here. The first is the amount, how intense this is going to be on my image. When I pull this all the way down to the left, this is our original photo. As I slowly take the amount slider and push it over to the right, it's going to add kind of a contrast, a little bit of a soft glow, not a glow in the sense that it's detracting from the detail of the image, but it's got this nice, soft, bright white haze on the photo. And as I continue to push it over, it also adds just a little bit of saturation. So you can already see a pretty big difference between our before and after. This is our original photo, very flat, kind of dull, not a lot of bright spots and not a lot of color. And this is just with a very basic sunshine filter. What's awesome about this sunshine filter is you have a couple of other options down here to make other adjustments. The first is the warmth slider. When you have an image, let's say you took in the fall or the summer, you'll take this and you'll move this over to the right to add a warmer tone to the image. It creates more of a golden hour style, but you can also push this to the left to create a cooler style to your image. So for this image, I'm going to push it down to the left and add that bluer filter. I'll pump up that amount just a bit more. I can also take my saturation slider if I want to add a little bit of intensity to the colors and move that to the right as well. Just with one filter, I've taken an image that doesn't really give the feel of winter and I've completely readjusted it. I absolutely love the sunshine filter for pretty much everything. This also works great on winter landscapes too. You don't have to just use it on portraits. Now, what's also nice about this is if you are going to add a glow to your image, you can take the glow slider on the bottom of the sunshine filter and move that over to the right too. I don't typically like to use this glow. I access some of the other ones that are going to be in the glow section of the filter library. But just in case you want to add a very subtle one to your image, you can take that bright glow slider and move it to the right. Now, the next thing that I would do is I'm going to click in my filter stack. I'm going to click that little plus button here, and it's going to give me another layer. The other tool that's very useful when editing images like this is, this was a pretty bright day, and despite the fact that it had snowed, it was very, very cold. It was very, very bright. There was tons of snow on the ground, and everybody was wearing scarves and hats, which is fantastic. It's great. Everybody wears scarves and hats during the wintertime. One of the biggest problems is if the hats have some sort of rim, you're going to end up with this shadow that you'll see right underneath his, or right above his brow. So right here underneath that little rim over his eyes and the top of where his eyebrows are is very dark. And this happens a lot when it's bright and sunny on a snow day and everybody's bundled up, or you're taking pictures of landscapes and you've got a lot of shadows that are going to be happening underneath some of the trees or the other elements that you have. That's when our adjustment brush is going to come in handy. It gives you the ability to selectively lighten or darken or make any other changes to certain areas in your photo. It's this little icon right here. It's a brush in your filter stack with a plus and minus button on the top and the bottom. And when I click it, what it does is it creates a layer with a black mask, which means I can't see the changes that I make to the image until I hand paint them in. This is also makes it a little bit easier to do the same technique if you have something called a tablet. Wacom sells these little tablets and you can use a pen and actually paint changes in, and I find it very useful. It works just the same with a mouse as well. I just find it a little bit easier to have access to a tablet. Now, underneath, before we start painting, you'll see in the filter options pane, you have a couple different presets you can access. Right now it's set to lighten, which is exactly what I want. I want to lighten the area underneath his cap right here. You can also adjust how much brightness you want to add. Right now it's really high. I've added a lot. I can lower this down if I want it to be a little bit more subtle. And you can make any other changes that you want. Let's say that I want to go in and also add a little bit of coolness. It's kind of warm underneath that area on his hat. Let me zoom in a bit so you can see it a bit more. It's a little bit warm underneath there as well. So I can take my warmth slider and make it just a bit cooler. Now once I'm done, I'll just take my brush tool and we'll click and paint underneath his face. If you want, you can use the perfect brush to be a little bit more exact about the adjustments that you're making. I didn't think I really needed it in this image, but you still can use it if you want to, which is really, really great. Very, very quickly, let me show you that before and after. This is that original photo with that dark shadow underneath his cap, and this is our after. Very simple. We added a little bit of brightness under there, but it intensifies his eyes and we can actually see them a bit more, which is really nice. I would use the same exact technique in the filter stack, that same adjustment brush that we just used, to also add selective detail. I don't want to add a lot of heavy detail to his jacket right here. I don't really want to add a lot to the out of focus areas. This was shot at a pretty low depth of field, very, very shallow. So I don't have a ton in focus here except for the tips of his, like right on the edge of his face, and everything in the back is kind of falling out. And I like that soft focus style. And that's when adding selective detail is a good idea so that you don't ruin or add a lot of high detail, high contrast to the snowier, soft areas in your image. So we'll use that same adjustment brush, go down to the little detail preset and click it on, and go through, and I'm just going to paint over the areas that I want to add detail to. Now this is a lot of detail, quite a lot. On the right-hand side in that filter options pane, I can just drop that down a bit more so it's not quite so intense. I'm going to go through and we'll paint over his eyes, maybe paint over his eyebrows there a bit, paint on the hair on his chin. And if I wanted to, I could also paint over, let's say, the scarf, if I wanted to intensify the scarf a little bit too. And it's basically just adding edge contrast to the image. So it's not a very intense idea behind adding detail. It's not actually going into the out of focus areas and making it appear as though it's in focus, but it just crisps up a lot of those edges in there that I want to look a little bit more intense. And the last thing that I would do with this photo is add a vignette. Very simple, very basic, but it's always a good technique to use when you're done with your images. Let's take a look at that before and after really quick. This is our original image, straight out of camera, no adjustments made to it. And this is our after image. Very subtle adjustments, very simple changes, but very easy ones to do here in effects, which is great.